On the other side of the front door to the violin shop are cabinets and curiosities, including a copy of Paganini's favorite picture of himself, along with his creed. And right below are two of Paganini's most prized possessions. Copies do exist, most of them in bronze, yet this is the original medal, struck in silver and presented to Paganini at the height of his career as he entered France in 1831. He cherished this medal for the rest of his life and bequeathed it to his son Achilles after he died. On the front is what would become Paganini's favorite engraving of himself. And on the back, an elaborate image created by the sculptor Anton Bovi to represent who Paganini was, and that his fame would never perish throughout the years. Paganini loved this particular medal so much that he had hundreds of oversized copies made, and he covered one of his ceilings with them. And you thought I was eccentric. Later, after he died, this same image was carved on the front of his tomb and is still there to be seen today in Parma. This other medal, in its own way, is just as special and was presented to Paganini by the Barnabite Order of Catholic priests in Italy. Paganini received this honor at a time when the rumors were running rampant that he had sold his soul to the devil, while many in the audience believed that the only way that Paganini could play as well as he did was because the devil was standing behind him, guiding his bow during each of his performances, all of which Paganini adamantly denied. Yet the rumors stuck, and they plagued his reputation. So, in a sign of good faith, because the Barnabites knew that even though Paganini had his faults, Niccolo Paganini believed in God and was a sincerely religious man. And they loved his music. The priests decided to present him with their most prestigious medal, especially for a musician. Though at the time they did have a small dilemma, because being one of the more humble and simple orders that had taken the vows of chastity, obedience, and poverty, this medal had always been struck in bronze. And they knew very well that Paganini considered any award made of bronze or copper to be an insult. So, the Order of Barnabites had this one single medal, possibly the only one ever, struck in silver, in order to properly honor Paganini. Not everyone who works hard and does their best is as honored as Paganini was. And there have been many that have tried and failed along the way. Yet, isn't it nice to know that once upon a time, there really was a small boy who dreamed and practiced so hard that he really did go on to become the greatest virtuoso who had ever lived, and changed the world with his music. There are so many wonderful things tucked away in the cabinets of the entry, many of them from the Romantic School of Music's archives, and some of the most wonderful ones aren't even supposed to exist, and I'll try to get to all of them eventually. But my mold is waiting, and it's time to go back into the violin shop and get to work. The violin shop itself is enormous, and the other areas contain tools and equipment beyond most people's imagination. Yet, this small area is where I spend about 90% of my time, carving and varnishing violins, violas, and cellos for each unique customer. And almost all of that time is spent right here at this old workbench. While there needs to be a strong glue joint between the ribs and blocks, the mold gets removed from the instrument after the ribs are completed. So the areas next to the blocks must be waxed in order to keep them from getting glued to the ribs. Stradivarius almost always used willow for his blocks and linings, and Guarnerius spruce. But I like to leave my options open and use both. Small templates are used to mark the blocks, and after being roughly cut to shape, the corner blocks and end blocks are temporarily glued to the mold. Keep in mind that if a violin maker is careful and uses the right amount of glue, a mold can be used many, many times over the years. The ribs are roughly sawn using a bandsaw and a fence. And yes, instead of using traditional apprentices, I have a couple of power tools that help keep my hands fresh for the work that really matters. And I leave plenty of extra thickness for the hand scrapers. Because even in this age of science and technology, a cabinet scraper still works like magic, especially when being compared to sandpaper. After all, what is sandpaper but sand glued to paper? And each tiny particle scratches the surface of the wood until it appears smooth, yet it isn't, really. The finer the sandpaper, the smaller the scratches, but there will always be scratches, and the surface will always remain dull. Yet everything changes the moment you slice the surface of the wood with a scraper. The name really doesn't do it justice, because a scraper sharpened with a burnisher isn't really scraping at all, but actually slicing the surface of the wood with a curved, razor-sharp burr. It's one of the great secrets of Stradivarius varnish, because a scraper leaves the grain and texture of the wood crystal clear and beautiful before you ever pick up a varnish brush. After the blocks are marked and cut to shape, we come over to this corner of the violin shop to my old friend, the bending iron. You see, if wood is bent at room temperature, it springs back. It's kind of like how a bow and arrow works. And if you bend the wood too far, it breaks. Yet, if you take a piece of wood and apply the right amount of heat and pressure, you can bend that piece of wood further than you ever normally could, and it'll stay that shape forever. After the ribs are bent, they are marked, finished cut, and then glued to the blocks in 3 individual stages. The linings are also shaped on the bending iron, then mortised into the corner blocks and glued to the sides for the strongest, lightest rib structure possible. And in the next video, we'll begin carving the back.